this meeting, sí, vale. Okay, so today I'm gonna briefly tell you how, what I've been doing in my last 15 years, which will probably be a bit disconnected from what we will be doing from now on. So you will see that computational power was overcome by using some structuring of the problem, but I think that's also interesting. So I'll basically be telling you what why I'm here and why it makes sense that economists are in a department like this. Do we have pointer? No? Okay, so I will sit down. Okay. Oh, caray, Andreu.
It's ready.
Ready for tomorrow, huh?
Wednesday.
Wednesday. Super. Hòstia, saps que no tinc USB jo. Els Macs són molt pesadets. Hola. No, exacte. Anyway, so I'm basically going to try to convince you why it is useful to have economists think about algorithms and data. Okay, so my first item has already this question marks because I didn't understand my underscore, but this is whenever you see a question mark, it's whatever. So basically, economic studies how individuals make decisions, how societies, how the fact that individuals interact with each other leads to what we see in societies, and in the context of there being scarce resources. So you have to make choices on what to spend your time on, what to spend your effort on, what to spend your money on, and all of us have to decide that. And so how we end up distributing our time and resources. Hola. No, I'm fine. Sí. So anyways, so if you think about if you think about economics, you probably thought always about markets, right? So there being prices determining who gets what. And so how do people decide what to spend their time on or their effort or whatever? Well, for many of the goods, it's just you go, you see how much money you have, you see what's there, and you make your choices based on that, okay? But that ends up being a very small part of the decisions we make, actually. So there's a very large part that is not determined through prices. So there's many goods that, how much effort you devote to studying versus working, how many, school spots, who gets what school place, who gets to what university, who gets what kidney, what doctor, husband or wife or whatever, partners. So there's all these different decisions that end up determining our lives, and many of them are not governed through prices, right? But still, economists want to think about how do people make these decisions, and how does the way we organize societies affect the decisions we make and the final outcomes, okay? So also vaccines, no, was a huge issue. We didn't want prices to govern who was getting vaccines for COVID, no? So basically, if you go and take economics, for 4 years, you study the case where the following conditions are true, which is everybody knows what they want, everybody knows what is there. There's prices that reflect how scarce each good is, and so how much you need to sacrifice of other things to get this particular good. My behaviors don't affect what others get or not. So if I contaminate, that doesn't affect anybody else. If I get education in a given school, that doesn't affect what others get. There's all these assumptions that are made. There's also the assumption that everybody knows what's there and that there's infinite number of people, so that nobody really has a power to determine who gets access to where, but it's just this very competitive situation. And it's true that if all these things hold true, but then we could go I don't want to spend too much time, but basically this doesn't hold ever, but all of economics and all of the good things about markets are based on all these things being true, Okay, but then if these things are true, then markets, so if these things are true, markets are really the way to go, and you don't need anybody to think about anything else for most of the markets, because you could regulate it through prices. But then I just told you there's many instances in which we don't use prices. And why is that? We don't use prices because we know there's externalities. We know that we don't want endowments, like how much money people have to determine the final allocation. And basically, we have more and more, if you think about the last 10 years, there's been an increase in the number of markets that have been created, like all these platforms that are intermediating demand and supply, that are making very evident that people don't know all the options that are there, because otherwise Amazon would not exist, because everybody would already know what is there and where you could consume. Also, Airbnb would not have a place, and there's all these other markets that would simply not exist. So the fact that we have all this other markets that are trying to overcome these informational problems is telling us that the basic theory in economics does not hold true. Also, when externalities like pollution, like in education, you want people to mix. Segregation is a big issue in thinking about education. All these things reflect that there are big externalities, and you don't want and you want to incorporate those in thinking about how people interact, to make sure that incentives are such that people do the right things. Okay, so we have all kinds of coordination problems. Also, people don't know what they want. You don't even know what is there. So it's very hard for you to understand what you really like or not like, because you don't know the characteristics of all these things. And so that's why market design has, increased its relevance more and more in the last, I would say, 20 years. Okay, and there's all this concern about this being efficient, in the sense that if you efficiency in this case, that means that people should not be able to go outside of the market and find a better trade outside of the market. Trade being that you can get yourself a different school, or that you can get a different match, let's say, that is better for you. Fair also means basically all kinds of characteristics that one could think about, and I'm going to mention some. And then stability just means that people want to really use that market and don't want to go anywhere else. Okay, I'm going to try, and I'm actually going to give you maybe a little bit too much, but basically what I want to tell you, that at the end, and especially nowadays, this market design has basically turned to algorithm design, because you're thinking about, so in a platform like Amazon, in the end, you're thinking about how the people that are going to come and search through your browser, who's going to see what prices, what's going to happen once they click, who's going to see what. And so there's all these algorithms that are behind this artificial markets, right? Or markets that are intermediated, right? And so markets are more and more intermediated by these algorithms. And so it's important to understand how these algorithms are understood by people, because that's going to shape how they interact. So if you know what these algorithms do, and I'll show you with a few examples, people will react to those algorithms. And so you may not end up getting what you want because of the way you're altering how people behave. Okay, so, but my intention today is to show you this in a very particular scenario. So I've spent many years thinking about school choice and college admissions. And so today I'm gonna basically focus on this very narrow set of problems, but I hopefully will give you a flavor of how important it is to have this perspective, to really think about how you want to design these algorithms. Okay, so here in this department, we're basically designing our algorithms using past data and hoping people will interact with those. But maybe we should also make sure that we think about how people will react to that, the data that will generate, and hence the final properties of these algorithms. Okay, so I think the main added value that economists bring in is to understand that individuals will do what they want and not what you tell them to do or what you expect them to do. They just really will optimize. They will look at the circumstances, what they know, what they don't know, and they will optimize. And incorporating that when you're designing your algorithms is going to be important for their effectiveness. Okay, and I'm just going to give you a very concrete example to get a flavor of how important that may be. Okay, so something else that I also will want you to get at is that in many cases, when you're thinking of an algorithm, you're saying, okay, I'm going to first ask people about something that I don't know to then decide how, I don't know. So I can ask them, well, for instance, what schools they like. And based on that, I'm going to design an algorithm that assigns them to the best school for them. Okay. But depending on the algorithm you use, families will tell you different things. Okay. And they will not necessarily tell you what they want. Or think of the following example. So if I'm telling in my community, we want to put an elevator, and then we say, how much does everybody want the elevator to be there? And everybody will say, no, we really want it. We really want it. And we say, okay, now we're going to split the cost depending on how much you want the elevator. Okay, so from 1 to 10, how much do you want the elevator? And then if you want it more than others, you will pay more of it. Okay, maybe how much you reveal to me that you want the elevator is going to be different than if I tell you, no, I'm going to pay for the elevator just if enough people like it. Okay, so the way data is collected, the questions that are asked, and what is going to be done with that information can completely change the value that the data has. Okay, so that's going to be really, really important, and is basically at the core of all this algorithm design, which is, well, what you're going to do with this data is going to be key for the value of the data and then for the value of the algorithm overall. Okay. So I think that's going to be important for me, that the value of data is not so much in the label that describes it, but actually in the context that tells you what it reflects. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so basically I'm going to show you how thinking about the process in which the data is collected can help you really get at the underlying things that we care about to then do proper simulations. Okay. And sometimes it's not as straightforward. And as I said, I'm just going to tell you with this very specific example because it's been a huge, it has been, I think, overemphasized. I actually think too much. So school choice in the past, if you think about 30 years ago, basically everybody was assigned their neighborhood school. You lived in a neighborhood, you were assigned to your neighborhood, and that's it. But then in the last decade, since the 2000s, basically all countries have said, well, families maybe should have more capacity to choose, basically because otherwise families were desegregating into neighborhoods, and so maybe the quality of the school is not is reflective of the quality of the neighborhood, and then it doesn't provide equal opportunities. So they said maybe we should. So for instance, they looked in Paris and saw that different neighborhoods had different prices depending on the school quality. So you had neighborhoods that were like they looked at the prices at the boundaries of neighborhoods, and they saw that at the right, sometimes it's even the same street, but on the right hand, it's this neighborhood, and the left is other neighborhood, and they saw there were housing prices differences. Well, you should probably know that, no? But even in Europe, no, this was in Paris, you see that the housing prices reflects school quality, and then you think about, well, if we want education to be free, it doesn't make much sense that the housing prices reflects the value of education. Okay, so then they said we should just separate the two things and facilitate that people can choose more. Okay, and that basically means you avoid housing prices capitalizing the value of schools, you increase equal opportunities, and then of course there were also the concern of, well, are all families want to take advantage of that opportunity? Are poor families not going to know, maybe, or maybe the distance to the better schools is going to be more costly for them to overcome, and is this ultimately going to lead to more segregation? Okay, but then anyways, the goal was, let's have families choose. Okay, concern, well, if you let everybody choose, actually I was in Holland last week, and there's no capacity constraints, so everybody can go just wherever they want for college, for example. Here, not even for college nor for primary and secondary schools, capacity is actually fixed. So you cannot just say everybody can pick where they want to go to school because there's capacity constraints, okay? Okay, so then you have to facilitate that people can choose, but then there's this capacity constraint. So you have to design a rule that makes sure that you define how you want people to tell you what they want, and then you can decide how they will be assigned to schools, given that capacity is limited, okay? So in many places they just do queuing, they do all these things, okay? In more organized places, which are the places that I look at, the problem is centralized, okay? So there's a central administration that collects information and then decides some rules under which all the information collected will be leading to a final distribution of individuals to schools, okay? So if you think about it, so basically they asked, so they said, well, not everybody's going to be able to get their first choice, so we should also make sure that we give them, that we collect other information. So they collect a rank. Sometimes this rank is capped, sometimes is infinite. We could talk about that. That leads to different properties, but anyways, but basically you're going to ask for a list of schools, and then you're going to have to decide what to do with it, okay? And what they do in 80% of the cities is they take everybody's choices and they put everybody in their first choice. And if there's over demands for certain schools, they rank them according to some point system. Okay, so whether you live close to the school, whether you have siblings in the school, whether you're low socioeconomic. So there's different characteristics that allow you to rank applications. And then if there's ties, there's a random number that basically orders everybody. Okay, and then those who get their first, those who are ranked higher, they get the spot, and those who are ranked lower, they're rejected. Okay, and then the way it works in 80% of the cities is that those rejected can only opt for schools in the second round that have free seats, and so you keep assigning seats with the leftover seats. You do the same in the second round. So you put everybody in the remaining seats, and you go like that until everybody has a seat in the school. Okay. If you look at the results, is that everybody gets their first choice. Like 93% get their first choice. So people, this is a really good mechanism. It assigns everybody into a very nice spot. Okay. Problem. Is there a problem? In terms of accuracy, and performance of the algorithm, results are great. If you had to play this game, okay, you live in a neighborhood that is not very good, and the school right next, no, you live in a neighborhood that is pretty decent, but it's not the best, okay? And there's another school next to you that is not in your neighborhood, but that you really, really like. If you apply for it first, in the second round, your school, which is decent, may be full already. So then you don't want to apply for your best preferred school. Okay, so the first result that opened up this literature was saying this mechanism that everybody's using induces families to be strategic. Okay, so the results that 93% of the families get their first choice is because families apply for what they know they will get. Okay, and that's a very different thing to say than saying, okay. So that's what is called the immediate acceptance mechanism, okay? So I went to the city of Barcelona and I asked for this data. This is how things look here. I took out the siblings that would increase the numbers to 90 whatever, like everywhere else in the world. And every year in the newspapers, they say Barcelona is a great city because everybody gets their first choice. Barcelona is a great school because everybody gets their first choice. And then us knowing the theory, we're like, oh, maybe they're just applying for the schools that they have neighborhood priority for, right? And if you look at this, you see that most of people's first choice are indeed the neighborhood school. Okay? And then for those that don't apply for that don't get their first choice, some of them get their second, but a substantial fraction, half of them, don't get any of the schools that they applied for. So the risk seems decent. Yes? So basically, when I was talking to them, I said, look, people are just applying for the school that they have priority for, but it's not because they like it. It's because you're forcing them because the mechanism has these, incentives behind it. And they're like, no, it's because they like the school. And honestly, they could be right and I could be right. Both are stories that would give you exactly this, okay? So I said, could you just give me the data? And they said, well, we're just going to give you starting in 2007, because in 2007, we did a change in the system. And so this prior data is not going to be useful to you. And I said, change, that's always good news for me. So what they did here, so before 2007, the city was divided into districts, and everybody in a particular district had priority for the schools in that district. That meant that if you lived in the corner of one district versus the other, there were some schools that were very close by, but that you didn't have priority for because they were from the other district. So in 2007, they changed and they applied an algorithm again to determine what schools people had priority for. And the rule was you would get highest priority for the 6 closest schools. So they geomapped all the schools and they computed basically the 6 closest, which is super nice for me, because that means that if you lived in a certain address, the schools that you had priority for changed before and after. So if people liked certain schools, they shouldn't be changing what they applied for. So the distribution of what people liked should not change. Okay, so I basically use that to try and see, hold on. Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna have time to tell you all the things that I wanted to tell you, but let me just say, so basically if you lived here, there were these schools that before you had priority for and now you don't. These are schools you always had priority for, and these are schools that you didn't before and you do now. And basically what we hypothesized is if people are just responding to these incentives and not really just applying for what they want, we should see that the people that apply to this school should be reduced and that the people that apply to these schools should be increased. And we do see that, okay? So let me show you. So actually the number of people who apply, so the numbers here split in half. There were 20% that were applying for these schools, which means that they were willing to go pretty far actually, because it's none of the 6 closest schools. So it was from 20% to 10%. And here it's actually increased by, it doubles, okay? So we have a reduction and it doubles here, which tells you that who you give points for what actually determines how people choose. And ultimately what this data and what people say they like says, right? Okay, so then the thing was, when people were thinking about this algorithm, actually after this first paper, which was basically theory paper showing that there could be incentives to lie, nobody had data. So this was like one of the first papers to show that people were manipulating, because we had this policy change that allowed us, because people were just in the graph before seeing that everybody applies for neighborhood school, but I don't know if it's because they like it or, okay. So we had this policy change, which was nice. And then in Boston, they said, we're going to prohibit this algorithm. I don't know if you lived through that. Yes. So we are going to move away from the Boston mechanism. It was actually called the Boston mechanism, to an alternative, okay, which was called Gale-Shapley, which basically the difference is when you get rejected from your first choice, you can apply to your second choice. And if you have more points than who was pre-accepted there before, you're first. Okay, so you can kick out somebody. So if you risk applying for something, that doesn't alter your probabilities of getting anything else. Okay, so they switched to this other algorithm. And then one of the writers of the first theory paper actually went and listened to the conversations with parents. And parents were like, no, but this is going to be really bad, because then those who really like a school will have no way of telling you. Because if you just are truthful, if you like it double or you like it the same, you're going to put exactly the same rank. But with this Boston mechanism, if you don't like it a lot, you will not risk putting it and you will just apply for your neighborhood. So they were saying there's some people tell you something about the intensity with which they like something, and that may be good. And so the same guy that actually promoted the change, he suddenly was like, maybe people were right, and there's actually some good things about the previous mechanism. So it's true that people were not truthful, but the way in which they were not truthful was telling me something about how much they like this. Okay, so that's that. And then another argument that we made was this may be true if it wasn't that there's private schools. And so for some families, they can take the risk because if they don't get what they want, they can go to private school. And then they can take higher risks than everybody else. And so they're going to have higher chances of getting the best schools in the public system. And I'm not going to show you, but we actually prove that in the city of Barcelona, those who have a private school risk a lot more than those who don't have a private school. Okay? So anyways, so we said, okay, so this Boston mechanism or this immediate acceptance mechanism has good and bad things. Who knows? The alternative was this one where you could be truthful. So in terms of incentives, it's very nice because people are like, oh, you can just tell the truth and that's it. You don't have to worry about anything else. Yeah, intensity, but who cares? You can just be truthful. That's it. And here's where knowledge about the context is useful. So because we wrote a theory paper showing that, okay, if you have a system that is this Gill-Shapley, and you have some schools that nobody likes, then you have these tiebreakers that are these neighborhood priorities. Even though families are truthful, in the end, everybody will be assigned to their neighborhood school. So people tell you that they like something else, and it's a math thing, huh? But basically, I don't know, it's 3 o'clock, so you must be very sleepy, but I could briefly try and tell you. Okay, so it's not complex, but if you can skip it if you want. But I think it's interesting to see that an algorithm that generally is thought to be very successful, if you have like some common things that nobody likes, then it screws up things. Okay. So for the schools, what happens is, suppose you two live in good neighborhoods and everybody else, we all live in this bad neighborhood. We would like any of these schools. Marcel wants one school and Juan wants Mercedes school. Okay, so we're all going to be truthful. Mercedes going to say she wants one and then hers and then ours, and he will do the same. Okay, but you only have priority for your school and you have it for yours, and we have priority for the school that nobody wants, so it's okay. So when you try and apply the algorithm, one is going to apply for Mercedes school, but so will we, right? Half of us. And then nobody has priority for her school. And so it's all going to be random. Okay, so we are all trying to get to her. She has not applied because she's still applied for his. Whether we get in, it's a random number. Okay. If we get in to hers, yeah, one will apply for his school second, and he will get it. And Merced will be kicked back to her school and kick us out. So the only way in which actually you two can exchange is if you both win each other's company. And the chances of that are just really tiny once this becomes large. Okay, so this
because
is
the point is that we live in that neighborhood.
Right. And so even though you want each other's schools, this algorithm is very bad at promoting that if there's some people that live in these schools that nobody wants. Okay. So we said, you guys are all changing mechanisms, but it could be all bad, right? So, but then people were like, this is the US having this debate, we're all moving, we're banning the Boston mechanism and whatever. In the UK, it was banned throughout the UK. So in the US, it's all decentralized. So some cities decided to change and some not. But UK, banned throughout the country. Okay. So here, when I was talking to the administration here, they're like, we don't want to change. And then I said, that could be the right decision to make, but it would be really nice to estimate whether that's true. Okay, and then we said, would it be possible to simulate what would happen here if we changed? And what happens is here we have the data that is actually not truthful. So we cannot do the counterfactual of what would happen if people told the truth because we don't know what the truth is. So here's where economic thinking helps you, because we said, okay, people are not telling us the truth, but we know they're being optimizers. So we can understand the choices they are making and try to learn what their preferences are. Okay, so what we do is basically, if you think about, you try and estimate preferences that are based on distance to the school quality, and some characteristics, and then you throw in some parameters to what the preferences may be, and you look at how much each individual should like each of the schools, depending on the parameters that you've assigned to each of the aspects of the school. Okay, so that would allow you to estimate, once you have parameters, you can say how much you would like each of the schools. And then each of the schools, if you know the probabilities of accessing each of the schools given your point systems, you can try and learn how much you must like a school, because so let me put it another way. If I know the probability distribution, the chances that you have of entering each of the schools, okay, I can try and learn how much you must like this school better than this one, given that you chose it. Okay, this was less likely that you got it, but it had this extra characteristics compared to the other one that was easier. So I can learn how much you like each one. Okay, so what we do is basically throw in parameters for the utility function and try to compare what the payoff would be of all this different lists that you could have submitted. Okay, and with that, looking at how coherent that is with what you actually do, I can actually estimate your preferences. Okay, and then in principle, this could be computationally very complex because you have 300 schools, and we should compare all the possible lists you could have submitted, which is, a list of 10. You have 300 schools, so there's very many combinations that you could do. But we actually came up with I'm gonna congest you, but basically we came up with a way of saying, okay, the 10th option is only gonna be relevant if you're expelled from all the other ones. And so that will basically, there's a set of schools that will already be full at that stage. So I can kick them out. So I can reduce the problem a lot. So we could compute it. We wouldn't have needed an HPC, but if you have more schools, you definitely would. So then what we did was extract the preferences and simulate what would have happened if we changed the mechanism and people could tell the truth. Okay. And what we saw is, let me just go to that directly. So what we saw, so this is that actually fraction of people that would have won from the change is 10%, and fraction of people that would have lost is 30%. So many more would lose from this change than win. Okay, and the ones who would lose more is the families that came from low socioeconomics. Okay, and you'd say, oh, that's strange, and you say no, because what was happening in Barcelona and in cities worldwide is people that have a decent neighborhood school, they don't take risks, because those who live in a really bad neighborhood, they do take risks because their school is always empty. No, but there's no competition for that. So they can take risks, and they're more likely to get it than with the alternative mechanisms where people kick them out in the second, third, or fourth round. Okay, so this is something that we did and we published, but this was Barcelona. So Andres would have probably had something to say. This was Barcelona, and it was a Spanish team. So, now we know that in the UK, the impacts have been also bad, but we've learned that now. This was earlier. Okay, so understanding very well the context was really useful to fine tune and understand why 80% of the cities were doing what they were doing. Okay, so coming in and thinking you can do much better just like that, maybe not. Okay, so to me, it's gratifying to see that people sometimes know more than people who first think about this. Okay, how are we doing? Okay, I'm rushing, but that's so that's one example of how understanding. So even though the algorithms, like there was these were mathematicians thinking about the algorithms, and they had very general properties that are very good, like incentives being aligned, stability, which has a property that basically means nobody will want to leave this market. So there's all these characteristics that are general, that are very good, but then if you go to particular context and add the intricacies of the context, then some of these things do not hold true. And so that's why it's important that we understand these things, okay? So another example that I wanted to give you was college admissions, okay? College admissions works with the Gale-Shapley, which is this other mechanism where if you don't get your first choice, you still go to the other spots only depending on your grades. So the advantage there is that you have grades. In primaries, I mean, in H3, you had neighborhood and stuff like that because you didn't have other criteria that could be justified to screen people out, right? So in college, there's the grades, and then you also apply, so you submit a list of, let me, hold on. Yeah, and so you submit a list and you rank based on your grades, which are very often partly standardized exam and partly your GPA in school. Okay. And in this, so basically this is very convenient because then you can just apply an algorithm that we know works very well to just assign people effectively into colleges. Okay, but then I'm going to show you some things that are actually not so good about it. Okay, or not good or bad. It's just worth thinking about it. So, and this is something that we discovered when COVID came by because it was March, and in June you were supposed to do this standardized exam. Okay, so we had all these kids that were supposed to do this super high stakes exam that was going to determine where they can go to school. And because of COVID, we couldn't really do it. And so they were postponing it and making it maybe it should be happening later, ignoring that many people have remained home and who knows in what conditions versus others that were actually having a nice time baking cakes and having a nice time with their parents. So when that happens, I thought, I mean, this is a good instance to use a predictive model. So these people are in last year of high school. They already have their grades mostly. So it's March, almost the year is almost over. So we could use their grades, use historical data to predict how well they would do in the final exam, and just use that, and that's it, right? So I tried to do the exercise of seeing what would happen if that was done. Okay, so we used historical data to predict the prior year in which we did have selectividad. And to our surprise, the prediction was not very good. So I honestly don't think there's a period in one's life where things are prepared for 2 years so much for something, right? So I would have thought the prediction would have been really sharp. But actually there was a lot of error. And another thing that to me was very interesting, and maybe you should not look at that, but if you had to think about what is the subject matter, so we tried to predict how, looking at how well you did in school, how well you would do in the selectividad, okay? What do you think is the grade that is going to be more predictive? Or the one in which you improve more, you're going to improve more in selectividad. What would you think that would be? So people think math, no? Because you think if you're good in math, you're probably good at all these other subjects. And it's English. English. And you're like, what? So you're thinking of predictive you're thinking of the production function, right? You're thinking if you know more math, right? But if you see the coefficient of English is much larger, that means that kids who get higher grades in English do better in selectividad. Does that mean that we should all? No, it's not that. I mean, I think the only subject you don't learn in school is English.
Exactly, it's a confounding variable.
It's a confounding variable, right? It's
Yeah,
actually
it's a-
capturing something, which is how much your families are investing in you other than the school. Right? So it's interesting first to understand that, but also if you think about it, suppose we said, look, this whole selectividad is creating a lot of stress. So from now on, we're just going to use this predictive model for this, right? What would people do? Studying.
Go to English schools or English centers.
English schools, right? Because that. So that's also illustrative of the dangers of using this thing systematically, no? And then
Causality is
exactly. So causality is extremely important, and then you know, huh?
I think that English thing, I think it's like it really then also differentiates per country, right? Like this, the English level in Spanish education system is generally not very high, so
Right.
it's not a good indicator. But I think in other countries where there is a more emphasis on English in the instituto, it doesn't work anymore.
Right.
Prone.
So if
the Netherlands.
if there is a subject where that people mostly don't do it in school, but have a lot of support outside of school, then it's gonna be here, right? So I think English is great because in Spain it's really really extreme. But I think in many countries there's a lot of extra curriculum. I'm sure in Latin America.
But
Yeah.
maybe
The Netherlands would be math.
Maybe
Maybe the
not
level is so
Netherlands.
high that every kid needs to go to
Yeah.
tutoring classes if your family can pay for that.
Yeah.
Right, but then maybe English would also reflect that then. What do you think? So how do poor people do it?
So like English, you get taught in high school, and it's really well.
Ah,
And math, because the level they want it so
Ah,
high,
okay.
only rich people
Okay.
can afford the tutoring outside of
I
of
see.
class.
So in your case, you think math would capture that
Yeah,
more?
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So, but then
need to test it anyway.
anyways, so another thing that is also interesting is so there's so we don't use a predictive model. So another thing that is important is we're going to be capturing the ability of people with this one time thing, right? Like this example. And people don't react the same way to one time things. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but I wanted to just show you that there's evidence that females and basically minorities overall, but for females we've done it. I mean, we could do it a lot more because we have more. We basically had better data for that. We basically show that in so females always do better in education, and then in high stakes situations they do relatively worse. Okay, and so that basically means that yeah, so basically we have this results just seeing that like females do better, and then when it's high stakes they do relatively worse. And then we also see that in Korea, where we actually have administrative records for all the population, so this was only done with the one school. In Korea, we see that that's also true, but only for co-ed education. That in single-sex schools, boys do very weird things in the sense that they prepare a lot more for low-stakes exam, which is something that they generally do not. So it seems like the sociological, how they perceive this one stakes exam is very different, and they hence prepare. I could go into details of how we get at this, but we see that the effort that they spend is higher for single sex. So basically, this is just saying females do worse under this high stakes, and they have their strategies to overcome that by preparing more and whatever. But then this has consequences when you think the titles are messed up. I'm sorry. So in 2010, there was a reform in selectividad, and the weight that they gave to selectividad was different. So it used to be 40%, and they increased it to 60%, basically by saying, okay, the grades were from 0 to 10. Now we're going to add 2 points, 2 extra points, and 2 extra points. So the grades are going to be from 0 to 14. And these 2 extra points are only going to be for the subjects that matter more for the career you want to study. So if you want to do physics, then maybe it's physics and math. And if you don't want to do humanities, maybe it's going to be Latin and whatever. So 2 particular subjects. But then at the end of the day, what mattered is this 4 extra points that were only coming from selectividad means the general weight was higher for selectividad. And then we said, oops, potentially this is harming females, okay? So there's two things. One is the reweighting, I mean, the fact that some grades matter more, and that is aligned with matching people with what they're good at, which makes a lot of sense. But there's also the side effect of just increasing the weight of selectividad, which is not so good. And so what we saw is these are the grades that we're getting. So these are females and males. After the policy change, females actually do worse. Okay, and there's two reasons for that. One is just mechanically. I told you that they do worse in high stakes exams. So if I'm giving more weight to that, then okay. The other is because I know it's higher stakes, maybe I'm going to do even worse, right? And so we simulated, and there's basically both, but the mechanical is pretty large. And then this is the behavioral, the difference between this and that. Okay. And then we said, okay, so there's this differences in how we capture, I mean, the reaction to these different circumstances leads to different performance, but then maybe we're selecting for better students. Maybe this reaction to pressure is actually something good, right? And maybe that allows you to do better in university. And so maybe it's okay that university is selecting for that. So we basically did a predictive model of just saying, okay, given what I knew about you before college admissions, can I predict how well, looking at past data from the universities, can I predict how well you will do? And then see how the selection of people have changed with the policy change and try to impute whether I've selected better or worse students, okay? And what we see is actually that these are, so I'm not going to tell you how in details how we do this, but this is basically, if you had characteristics that tell us that you were harmed by the policy, this is your predicted college performance. And if you had characteristics where actually the policy change was good for you, then this is how well you would do. So if we look at only females, we see that actually the reform is picking up those who will do better. So in that sense, it was a good reform. For males, we also see that the males that were harmed by the policy were doing worse than the males that were benefited by the policy. So that's also good. But then if you see the females that were not getting into college anymore were better performing than the males that got in. Okay, so there's this across gender thing. Bottom line, I don't know if this is good or bad, but it's worth thinking about it. Like, what are we selecting for? Are we priming? What is it that we want to prime? What is it that we want to select for? The fact that it's distributed differently across genders is just a coincidence, but it does make you think about what is it that we're selecting for. So the fact that you say, I'm just going to collect this information about ability and screen based on that, you're actually you're having this impact on everything before and how people will react that will ultimately affect who you're selecting for what and what the implications of that are. Okay. So basically, designing algorithms requires that you think very carefully about how the context that you're creating is going to affect what people do. And what people do can be determined by incentives being changed, and it can be determined by the circumstance creating this extra pressure, non-pressure, whatever, that can also change how people do. Okay. So we do need algorithms, but we do need to understand enough how they're affecting how my behavior affects my final allocation, because people will care about that and will respond to that. And so we need to incorporate that to the design of our algorithms. That's it. Any questions?
Okay, so now we're always using like the who lives closest by, right? And that gives you a big advantage now, like if you live close by. But since we know that spatial segregation is such a indicator for your entire future, if you could be in the ministry right now, what would you choose?
So actually in Amsterdam, they took out neighborhood priorities. It's Actually, Amsterdam is really amazing. These are the only people that ever asked me what my paper said because they wanted to understand, because they had this, parents were involved and everybody was involved in designing it. And they had decided, given what the literature was saying, to use this alternative mechanisms, but without the neighborhood, because then it works fine. But then it's really, so they tried single tie breaking and well, they tried to do it like that. And then what happened is that it became evident that when people start reporting what they really like and they get their 20th choice, then politically that was very uncomforting. And so they ended up so they actually changed it again. And they said, we want to make sure everybody gets at least their 12th choice for some reason. Okay, and they said, okay, so how are you going to make this happen? And how should you react to that? So if you know you're going to get one of your first 12 for sure, then you're going to try to put all these over-demanded schools first, and the one you like within that. So you're not necessarily going to say what you want, but so again, this is gonna, so anyways, to your question, they tried to do it in Amsterdam and it didn't survive because politically people didn't like that families were not getting, they were revealing what they wanted and it became evident that they were not getting what they wanted. And so it felt like people were very unsatisfied, even though with this alternative mechanism, people are just skipping this 20 schools that you're not getting into it and directly applying for the one that they can get. So even though it was much more fair, because at least it was not like the neighborhood mattering, the fact that people could be truthful and would not be biased by anything, basically meant, you could get many. So if you did this and you got priority for your neighborhood, we know you're basically gonna get it very highly. But if you take that out, then it's gonna be random where you can get that given what you applied for. And so that created, politically, it was not very acceptable.
And you, like after some years of research, what would you recommend to the ministry?
I think the Gale Shapley random is
Still?
Yeah. Either this, the neighborhood part, I don't really get. I don't see, I don't think we should protect people by giving them this extra value to proximity if others also want to be in that same school and are further out. If you think about it, if you're willing to sacrifice to go somewhere. So the distance part, I don't think it's very easy to justify. So I would open it up and say random. But then it didn't survive because then it becomes explicit what people get. But then you should use this information to change how things, if you see that some schools nobody likes, and whatever, you should try and think what those schools have and whatever, so that you can. So I remember I went and presented this in Helsinki, and when I said no, because if there's some schools that are worse, then and why would that be?
Why would that be worse? Okay.
And I was like, oh, I thought they were joking. I was like, yeah. They're like, no, seriously, the government would go and do something about it. Yeah, I guess.
It's like Amsterdam would make like the distance thing. There's such big differences in social and economics. I think there's the biggest inequality isn't actually Amsterdam. So of course the people from the rich neighborhoods were definitely gonna. I don't know who complains about this, but we're gonna complain because if the kids from the Belmer, which are like one of the worst neighborhoods of the Netherlands, can finally move up to better schools. Like taking spots from the kennel kids.
Right. Because the problem is, I think all these choice mechanisms make a lot of sense when it's about heterogeneity. I like this and you like that. But if there's a rank and then some schools don't, then it's going to be problematic, because those who don't get it, if they're poor, then it's very bad. If they're rich, they're going to complain and it's not going to be sustainable. So it's, So you basically, that's why I don't think thinking about this alone makes sense. Because if there's some schools nobody likes, you're not going to resolve that with some mechanism if people have to read, So only if poor people remain there is it sustainable, because otherwise people complain. So it's sad, but it's
Question. I know that in Barcelona there is sort of like kind of this idea from the Computational, right? To try to give this point or have this point system that also benefits like the reality, so that the schools reflect like the reality of the neighborhood, right? In terms of who lives that in that neighborhood. How do actually that gets to families? Like, do families like that, or they really just want to get out of their neighborhood in case there is a bad school, as you put it, right? And this point system kind of hinders those families for that possibility, you know, because they're just placed there because the school needs to reflect the reality of the neighborhood.
So I think everything else equal, what we see when we estimated preferences is everything else equal, everybody likes to be close. Everyone, because of all these things. So, and you also, so something we don't capture is you actually like going to with people that are in the same neighborhood, because then you can, you know, coordinate on who. We cannot estimate that, but that certainly is something that would matter, no? The thing is, if some people are willing to come from far away, that means that their quality is so much lower that they're willing to give up on distance to actually do that. And so it's very hard to say, no, we're gonna give priority to the ones that are close and whatever. So from preferences, there's no, actually rich people are more willing to move further away. So if a poor family is willing to move away, that means that they, you know, are very exceptional and they really care about quality in a way that others may not. So it's very hard to justify that you give priority to people in the neighborhood. Yeah.
This is also problematic, right? Like depending, I don't know, because maybe in Barcelona, because public transport is free,
Right.
and everyone lives close by. But then thinking, for example, about the Netherlands, people cannot go to a school further away if you're poor because you cannot pay
Right.
the bus.
Right.
Like this like bike because you cannot pay
Right.
like, from certain. So then it would definitely not show
Right.
more willingness. It would just show like the economic.
Absolutely, absolutely. So so in our estimations we see that, no, that poor people care more about distance, and it's probably because of what you're saying. But despite the fact that they care more about distance, they still want, like some of them do want to move away, and would do it under some mechanisms and not under others. So even though there's this difference, it's still the immediate acceptance, which is what we have here, is better at accommodating that for those who are willing to, and this is personal. Yeah.
There's no more questions, the chat.
Okay. Sí.
I was wondering, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if there's been an estimation of how these different algorithms affect the perceived quality of the schools.
Right.
Like changes in the people who get to which school would make some school less desirable than others in the long run.
We haven't done that, but I think that's a, like, in general, it's a good point that if you put so much emphasis on which schools do you really like or not, and then people put a lot of effort in thinking about the schools, and they may overestimate how much it matters, right? So this is something that we don't know anything about, and I think it's very, I think how crazy we've become with making those choices has increased enormously. In the past, you just would go to the neighborhood and that's it, no, and now. So I wonder whether now, because you were forced to do that, then there's this marketing strategies that some schools can use and others cannot, because public schools don't do that. Public schools are like, if you want me, good, and if not, and contratadas are, you know, fighting for that. So it could be that the perception is the polarization has increased without the underlying thing being much different. And that's one of the problems with schools, that like the difference between added value, like how much a school really adds to you versus the perception that it's a good school because all these good families go to it. That's very hard to disentangle. Like how much is it the families and how much is it the school? Already. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.